The HMS Wager had shipwrecked while on a mission against Spain in the War of Jenkins Ear. The survivors had made a settlement on what they called Wager Island. They had a barge, a cutter and a yawl, and were lengthening the longboat so they could take the 100 or so survivors off the island. But there was disagreement in the leadership on which route to take. The Wagerians had to choose between Captain Cheap's plan to sail 350 miles north past Silloway to rendezvous with Commodore George Anson and continue the mission, or Gunner John Bulkeley's plan to sail 3,000 miles to Brazil through the Magellan Strait and to go home to England from there. Things were headed for a showdown. I am Yvette, this is Defragged History, and welcome to episode 3 of the story of the HMS Wager, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. All the links to my sources, the music and information on how to support the channel are in the description. This video was made possible by my supporters, fans and allies on Patreon. Thanks everyone! And now, let's make all the pieces fit. On June 21, 1741, Commodore George Anson saw the Gloucester and, after a roller coaster of emotions of her repeatedly disappearing and reappearing for over a month, she was finally able to go for anchor near the Centurion. They were given all the supplies, and the sick were carried to shore. When they saw Spanish cruisers off in the distance, everyone got ready to leave at a moment's notice. But they were still waiting for the Severn, the Pearl, the Wager, and the victualler, the Anna Pink. The Wager had wrecked, and the Anna Pink had found a harbor east of the island of Inchin. Those on the Anna were worried about the wild beasts and the wilder men, so they stayed close to shore, but they found plenty of fruit to restore the sick to health. They invited a curious native family, a man, wife and children aboard, and then, fearing they might alert others to their location, held them as hostages. They were treated well, including drinking a lot of brandy, for which they developed a taste. But 8 days later, the family cleverly escaped through a hole in the ship and set the Anna's boats adrift. After the crew finally got their boats back, they expected unwanted company to arrive soon, so they headed out to find Anson. On August 16th, the lookouts on the Centurion saw sail in the north. At first they thought she was the Trial, who'd gone exploring the nearby islands, but she was a three-master. It could be the Severn, the Pearl, the Wager, or yet another ship. It was their victualler, the Anna Pink. Huzzah! Flour had arrived, all rations were suspended. Well, not so fast. Because of all the water the Anna Pink had made, several of her casks had rotted, and her bags were soaked through, so many of her provisions like bread, rice, groats and such were decayed and no longer edible. As a result, the Commodore declared the Anna Pink dismissed from all service and she could go home. But Master Gerard was like, this ship ain't gonna sail anywhere. The bottom was decayed, the upper works were leaky, and the forebeam was broken. She needed to be refitted, which they couldn't do. So the Commodore plunked down £300 to buy all the furniture, that is, scrapper for parts, which would come in very handy for the rest of the squadron. Anna's foremast was converted into a mainmast for the trial sloop, and they left behind the mainmast on Juan Fernandez Island to make a mizzenmast for the Wager, should she arrive. The master and all hands went on board the Gloucester, which could use some extra crew. These 4 vessels that had some 1,200 men when they left England had lost more than half. If they tried to capture any place with the amount of men they had, and lost a mere 20 in the process, they'd be doomed. So what could they do? Well, since capturing and burning places was out, they opted for the second part of the mission, disrupt trade. Time to catch some ships. On Wager Island, base camp wasn't exactly split on their decision to go either north with Captain Cheap or south with Gunner Bulkeley. Most people scribbled their names on the paper outlining the Magellan Strait plan. Everyone was eager to go home, notwithstanding the many dangers and hardships that journey entailed. Nearly everyone signed it. The only people who didn't were Captain Cheap and his team of loyalists, the second highest ranking officer First Lieutenant Robert Baines, Marine Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton, Purser Thomas Harvey, Surgeon Walter Elliot, and the Captain's steward, Peter Plastow. On August 4th, 1741, at about noon, Gunner John Bulkeley, Master Thomas Clark, Carpenter John Cummins, and Boatswain John King went to have a little chat with Captain Cheap in his tent. The gunner held up the petition and read out loud, "We whose names are undermentioned do, upon mature consideration, as we have met with so happy a deliverance, think it the best, surest, and most safe way for the preservation of the body of people on the spot to proceed through the Straits of Magellan for England. Dated at a desolate island on the coast of Patagonia, the 2nd day of August 1741. Bulkeley handed the piece of paper to Cheap, who noticed the very long list of signatures. Nearly everyone had betrayed him, even his enforcer, Midshipman Alexander Campbell. All preferred survival and risk being court-martialed over continuing the failed mission. Cheap received the petition with no visible emotion and said very calmly, or rather indifferently, that he would consider it and give the men an answer shortly. Then he dismissed the group. With so many people willing to defy him, all he could do was stall for time. Something might happen that would change their minds, or they'd lose their enthusiasm, making them more susceptible to his plan and accept his authority again. The following day, the gunner, the carpenter, the master, the master's mates, and the midshipmen showed up at the captain's place again. Make a decision, or, well, there might be trouble. People needed answers. Cheap kept his emotions perfectly in check and calmly said he needed more time, and dismissed the men again. On August 6, 1741, Captain Cheap first called for his lieutenant Robert Baines, and then called in Gunner Bulkeley and Carpenter Cummins. He told them he'd been tossing and turning until 8 a.m. thinking about the petition they had presented him. Then it became clear to him they hadn't thought the plan through. They were over 160 leagues north from the mouth of the strait, and even if they made it to the other side, the route to Brazil was even longer. Plus, they'd be sailing against the wind and it would be hard to get water. In short, they were promising the crew a deliverance they couldn't deliver. Bulkeley countered. The navigators concurred it was 90 leagues to the strait. He and the lieutenant were navigators, yes, so they could easily calculate this and verify it themselves. And going to Juan Fernandez out to open sea? The chance of them finding the Commodore at Juan Fernandez was 500 to 1. What if the Commodore and the squadron suffered the same fate, or worse? The captain said, well, it's actually 1,000 to 1 they'd see the Commodore at Juan Fernandez because, he'd let him in on a little secret, the Commodore had orders to seize the badly defended Valdivia. But where did the captain think he'd get water? From the islands underway. Then where would he get provisions for 90 men? The captain answered easy. They'd seize a trading vessel in Siloé, laden with flour. Oh, right. Seize a vessel with what cannon, sir? Besides, the Longboat's hull is thin. One blast from a merchantman's gun below the waterline and they were at the bottom. The captain answered, what are our small arms for but to board ships? You really think a merchant vessel is out there alone? By herself? You can bet there's an armada nearby. And he expected a half-starved crew to operate a merchant vessel and keep ahead of these warships? Did he honestly think the handful of Marines left could put up a fight when most of them didn't even know how to fire a gun? The captain countered, what about the enemies you'll encounter in the strait? Enemies? What enemies, sir? Indians in canoes? Those are easily handled. No Spaniard lived that far south. The captain seemed to come around to their plan. So they might get salt to cure meat in St. Julian, and maybe they can seize a vessel at Rio de la Plata. But going to Rio Grande at the very bottom of Brazil made no sense. They should make for Rio de Janeiro, even further north. But then he countered the idea again. What about the headwinds? What about water? What if they drifted off course? Cummins said, either way there will be obstacles. Bulkeley said they'd keep their eye on the shore. But that would lengthen the journey, rounding every bay? Well, no, they weren't going to strictly follow the coastline, they'd sail from point to point. The lieutenant said nothing, which was odd. When Baines talked to Team Bulkeley, he was all in on their plan, but now in the captain's presence, he silently sided with Cheap. Bulkeley wondered why out loud. Hadn't the lieutenant wanted to sign the petition and only hadn't because there wasn't any room left? The captain looked at Baines, baffled. Et tu, brute? He knew of the plan? The mood turned dark, and Cummins hissed at the captain. It's all your fault that we're here in the first place. If he'd consulted his officers then instead of now, they might have avoided this disaster. He failed to consider the condition the ship was in, with all the men being sick and 3 seamen in a watch, with a mast that was expected to fall overboard. Instead, every step the captain took led them to this godforsaken place. Whoop, there it is. The quiet part said out loud. The captain protested, Gentlemen, you do not know my orders, they were very strict. If only 2 men had survived, he was still obligated to go to the rendezvous, the island of Nostra Senora del Socorro, no matter what. While his behavior might have been puzzling, he had to stick to the Commodore's orders. Bulkeley said, Even the Commodore would have used his discretion not to follow orders, if following them meant endangering the ships and her people. Well, there was no arguing that, so the captain didn't. He only said that while he was willing to go along with their plan, they had to consider his plan. And what did it matter? The longboat wasn't even finished yet. They could make the final decision once they were ready to leave. Bulkeley saw where this was going. Was the captain just going to ignore the petition? Unless they made a decision, people would refuse to work. Call it. The sooner the better. The captain was done talking and said that he would discuss it with all his officers. To politely dismiss them, he asked if there were any more objections. Bulkeley said, Yes, sir. I have one more. When they left, the captain was not to weigh or come to an anchor or alter course without consulting his officers. In other words, the captain wasn't supposed to captain on his own. Cheap was triggered. Who was he to curtail his power? At what point had he been deprived of his commission? He was the Wager's commander when she shipwrecked and remained the commander as long as they were getting any provisions out of her. In fact, everyone was still in service as long as they were salvaging things from the ship. The men piped down and said that they had always obeyed his orders to the letter and would still defend him with their lives. They still recognized his authority as long as he acted with reason and with the common welfare in mind. The captain acknowledged that. He still confided in them, didn't he? After this discussion, the captain rarely left his tent, which only made the people more unruly and disobedient. When Cheap checked the general vibe of the crew, he was shocked to learn that nearly everyone was still 100% Team Bulkeley. So he pretended to comply, and meanwhile he'd figure out a way to get everyone on board with his plan and complete the mission. On August 10, 1741, the rations for the survivors on Wager Island were again reduced, and the men now had nothing to live on but 1/4 pound of flour a day and what they could scrape off the rocks. The shellfish were pretty much picked into extinction, so what they scraped off the rocks was dark grey seaweed, which they boiled for 2 hours, coated in flour, and fried in the tallow from the candles until they were nice and crispy snacks they called slaw cakes. It made for a good and wholesome food. But the weather had been so bad for so many days, they'd not been able to move further out, even though they were almost starved. That night, Lieutenant Baines paid the men at the hotel a visit. Hey, fellas, I have an idea. Why not use the hotel as a church, with a service every Sabbath? Bulkeley was instantly suspicious. Why this sudden onset of religious zeal? They'd hardly done public prayer on board, though every seaman paid 4 pence a month toward the support of a minister. And a church service was so rarely performed that Bulkeley only remembered having attended once during his many years in the Navy. But Bulkeley suspected the request had little to do with God. He figured if their tent was turned into a house of prayer, they might, in the midst of their devotion, be surprised and have their weapons taken from them to frustrate their plans and prevent their return to England through the Straits of Magellan or any other way. So no, thanks. On August 11, 1741, Marine Corporal Roland Crosset slipped under the canvas of the store tent and stole a day's flour for 90 sols. He was caught and was found to have hidden a piece of beef under his coat. 3 more pieces were discovered stashed in the nearby bushes to be retrieved later. Marine Corporal Thomas Smith, who'd been guarding the tent, was arrested as an accomplice. The sailors were so mad, they picked up arms, stormed into the hotel, and hollered at Bulkeley and Cummins about the foul deed of the Marines. They argued that all the supplies should now be moved to the hotel, where Bulkeley would look after them much better than the captain and his cronies had. And the thieving bastards had to be severely punished. Bulkeley and Cummins agreed, but told the men that mutiny was an evil offense, so put the guns down, fellas, and let the law run its course. The captain sent for Bulkeley and Cummins immediately. What were they gonna do about this? What could they even do about this? The problem was that Cheap had no jurisdiction over the Marines. Still, he insisted Marine Captain Robert Pemberton convene a court-martial for the serious crime of starving the entire company, a crime which deserved the death penalty. Pemberton didn't care for the captain, but he trusted Bulkeley and Cummins. He said he'd go as far as martial law would allow him. Pemberton and Cheap now agreed all officers and all Marines had to stand watch. Only the captain and Carpenter Cummins were excused from watch duty. The captain because he was the captain, and he still had a useless arm, and the carpenter because he worked on the longboat every day. On August 12th, the rations were again reduced. They mostly lived on mussels, snails, clams, and fried and boiled seaweed. But these were harder to get. Meanwhile, people started to complain of eye pain and all kinds of other pains. Many were in so much agony that they couldn't walk. It became a tough call: stay in their tents and starve, or go out in the harsh wind and hail that cut their faces and search for food. Now the tide came in higher, which threatened to wash the blocks from under the longboat. Those who were strong enough hauled her up higher on the beach. The court to punish the thieving Marines convened with several officers presiding as judges. According to the rules, the corporals were found guilty. But when the articles of war were read, it was clear their crime did not touch life, at least not directly. Because it wasn't a capital crime, they could only be sentenced to corporal punishment. Both corporals were sentenced to 600 lashes each. And since Captain Cheap didn't think this was sufficient punishment, he also reduced their rations by half. The rest of the castaway crew were unhappy with this light sentence. The following day, August 15, 1741, both Crusted and Smith received 200 lashes. The day after, 200 more. But Pemberton and his officers, who'd been so adamant about carrying out the punishments, took pity on the men and dropped the third round of lashes, which would have reduced their backs to ribbons. Commuting a sentence wasn't uncommon, but in this case, it fueled the sailors' rage even more. By August 18th, the hunger was taking its toll. The carpenter, who'd been working tirelessly on the longboat from the moment she came ashore, noticed that one of the seamen cut up a piece of wood he planned to use on the boat for firewood. Cummins completely lost it at the man's indifference and egotism that had been spreading through base camp like a plague. The carpenter became delirious, and the men now pulled out all the stops to settle the carpenter's nerves, the only man who could get them off the island. The following day, the carpenter had recovered enough for him to return to work as usual. After talking to Bulkeley and Cummins, the captain ultimately decided to cut the two Marine corporals off from all supplies from the store tent. They'd have to fend for themselves. But if Cheap thought these punishments for thievery would act as a deterrent for others, he was gravely mistaken. A few days later, the store tent was robbed once more. This time, 12 days of brandy for 90 men went missing. Once more, 2 Marines were the culprits. They were Smith and Butler, who'd been guarding the store tent against thieves. How to handle this? The naval officers had no jurisdiction over the Marines, and while they wanted them hanged, their own officers did no investigation. The Marines were looking after their own. The rift between the sailors and the Marines grew. Meanwhile, the crew started prepping for departure. They needed to gather as much provision for the journey as possible, so they made punts, cask boats, leather boats and the like to venture out further to find food. The 30-year-old boatswain's mate Richard Phibbs jury-rigged a raft from a large barrel and 2 logs. He set off, mapping out the coast and shooting birds and whatever other animals he could find along the way. But he ventured out further and further to find wild fowl. At times he was gone all day, until one day he didn't return. His raft had been overturned by waves, and while he wasn't a swimmer, he managed to climb onto a rock. He had no hope of relief because he was too far from shore to be seen. 2 days later, another fowl hunting party discovered Phibbs on the rocks feebly signaling for help. They rescued him and brought him back. Phibbs wasn't deterred. He made a canoe-like contraption from hoops and oxhide which was used on board for sifting powder, and made several more successful fowl hunts. Gunner John Bulkeley was certain that Cheap would do the right thing and agreed to his plan to return to England via the Magellan Strait. Then, on August 24th, the gunner found out Captain Cheap had sent out his men to bribe the sailors to agree with his Great Northern mission. Not with money, but with, for a sailor, a much more valuable commodity, a daily extra allowance of rum and other strong liquors. He also heard that the captain had sent the purser Thomas Harvey to the deserters with casks of liquor to win them for his cause. What even? It's almost as if he didn't want to go home. On August 25th, everyone was shook. Literally. So, that was an earthquake. In fact, they were 4 violent earthquakes. Fortunately, the quake shifted no land. On August 27th, there was a disturbance in the force. The crew began to split into Team Cheap and Team Bulkeley, with everyone reconsidering the idea to go south with the gunner and perhaps stick with the captain. Following the captain meant being obedient to a likely doomed mission. Following the gunner was mutiny, with the voyage only being a little less likely doomed. Going with the captain meant going down in a blaze of glory. Going with Bulkeley would save their skins, unless they were court-martialed for mutiny and condemned to dance the hempen jig, that is, to be hanged. The split raised tensions. The gunner now believed that the captain was covertly working to undermine his plan, but if he did that, he was the one committing mutiny against the will of the people. Quartermaster Richard Noble even threatened to shoot Bulkeley, whom everyone deemed the cunning architect of the Magellan Strait plan. Bulkeley needed to stop this rift now, or they'd never get off this rock. Cummins and Bulkeley met up with Lieutenant Baines, who'd privately backed their plan all the way, but faced with the captain seemed to waffle. How could they restore unity? Baines advised them to draw up a remonstrance declaring that the ship's company wanted to go through the Straits of Magellan. They'd present it to the captain and make him sign the resolution to declare the plan once and for all, and that everyone would be united to one goal, getting past the strait. Every officer would be given a signed copy they could present in court in England to justify their actions. The fact that they even thought to draw this up meant they knew it wasn't on the up and up to begin with. Bulkeley and Cummins drew up the paper, distributed copies, and handed the one for the captain to the lieutenant. Baines was convinced Cheap would sign it. If he didn't, he'd look weak and selfish. In that case, they could simply arrest him for the killing of Midshipman Henry Cousins. After this, following naval hierarchy, the lieutenant would assume command. They would also send the purser, who'd recently become so chummy with the deserters, off the island as a punishment for acting contrary to his duty in contempt of the Articles of War, the law of this country, and the known rules of the Navy. All those who caused division among the crew would be disarmed. Bulkeley and Cummins thought they had the whole thing sussed, but didn't realize that what someone says and what someone does wasn't always the same thing. On August 28, 1741, Master Thomas Clark, Boatswain John King, Gunner John Bulkeley, Carpenter John Cummins, Cooper John Young, and Midshipman Alexander Campbell arrived at Captain Cheap's tent, all bearing arms. Lieutenant Robert Baines was already with the captain. The meeting got underway. First, they talked about what to do with the Marines, Smith and Butler, and it was agreed they would be transported to the Main or some island. Then Team Bulkeley said that a decision on the journey home had to be made yesterday because the crew was getting restless, and the covert attempts to obstruct their plans didn't help matters. The captain acted all surprised. There is no split. They couldn't execute either plan since they weren't ready to move out yet. A decision would only increase tensions. Besides, he'd already told them he didn't care which way they went, north or south. Whatever the castaways wanted, he'd share their fate, for the preservation of the crew. All eyes went to the lieutenant. Say something. But he didn't. He just sat there, silent, as if he didn't care either way. Bulkeley was baffled. Whose side was this guy even on? He let it go. Then he pulled out his own copy of the second petition they drafted and gave a dramatic reading. Whereas upon general consultation it has been agreed to go from this place through the Straits of Magellan for the coast of Brazil in our way for England, we do, notwithstanding, find the people separating into parties which must consequently end in the destruction of the whole body, and as also there have been great robberies committed on the stores, and everything is now at a stand, therefore to prevent all future frauds and animosities, we are unanimously agreed to proceed as above mentioned. Now sign it, sir. Well, the captain wasn't gonna do that and became enraged the gunner even suggested it to him. Bulkeley gave Lieutenant Baines the side eye, folded the paper, and continued the meeting concerning the issue of preparing provisions. They had to save 10 weeks' worth of food and they should bury the liquor so it couldn't be stolen. But the captain was so enraged, he didn't hear a word Bulkeley said and stayed silent. And so the meeting ended, with the captain not ordering anything for the preservation of the crew going north or south. That was bad form, really bad form. Team Bulkeley left empty-handed and went to the tent of the second highest ranking man on the island, Captain Pemberton. Much to their surprise, he'd hoisted a flag on his tent and sat on a chair, or should we say throne, surrounded by his men as though he were a king holding court. Team Bulkeley, sans Lieutenant Baines, discussed the situation with Pemberton. They'd followed his orders, whatever they were. Pemberton told them there was no need for that, but all agreed if the captain refused to sign the petition to confirm his verbal agreement, they'd strip him of command, hand it to Baines as per the lieutenant's own suggestion. The Marines gave 3 loud huzzas and shouted, "For England! For England! For England!" Captain Cheap, who'd just gone to bed, woke up from all the shouting. What in the devil? Mutiny? He quickly sent for Team Bulkeley. Where is the riot? Did he put the men up to it? Well, since he hadn't signed the paper and didn't care about securing provisions for the journey, a unanimous decision had been made to take his command and hand the reins to Lieutenant Baines. The captain was stunned. Hadn't he done everything in his power to preserve the stores? Hadn't he called for the severest punishments of the villains who robbed the place? He turned to the lieutenant and yelled, "Who is he that will deprive me of my command? Is it you, sir?" The lieutenant, faced with a fuming captain, turned white as a ghost and could hardly answer, "No, sir." Oh, good. Baines is a pathetic coward. Team Bulkeley left, leaving the lieutenant to face the captain's accusation of treason. But Cheap remained in power and was still convinced that Bulkeley wouldn't dare act against him without Baines, unless he wanted to dance that hempen jig once back in England. Team Bulkeley consulted with Pemberton about their next move, considering Lieutenant Baines was such a chicken shit. Then the captain called for Bulkeley again. This time the gunner brought some backup. Seamen armed with muskets who waited outside the captain's hut as Bulkeley entered. His honor sat with his pistol cocked and resting on his right thigh. Bulkeley backed away, even though he also had a cocked pistol and his backup posse. He didn't like the look of this at all. Outside, he asked the master's mate John Jones, whose judgment in navigation she blindly trusted, to tell the captain that the gunner wouldn't approach him while he had that instrument of destruction in his hand. The rash and undaunted captain could shoot him. Case in point, Midshipman Cousins. Besides, everyone could tell that ever since that incident, Cheap was losing his mind. He didn't want to die at the captain's hand, and was even less willing to take the captain's life in his defense. Cheap was still his commander, and the gunner bore him no ill will. When Jones told the captain this, Cheap threw his pistol aside and came out of the tent to face an angry, armed group. What were their gripes? He'd fix them all and go south with them, if they so wished. Everyone shouted loud as boars that they wanted the provisions to be reserved and secured for their voyage, and the rest to be equally distributed among them. No more plying anyone with liquor. Captain Cheap remained very calm, and with the sweetness of a friend told them that in their rudeness and rashness they hadn't considered the consequences of this redistribution. If they shared provisions now, it was live today and starve tomorrow. He'd always secured the provisions and ensured their continued survival, hadn't he? Bulkeley had to admit that the captain had balls coming unarmed before an armed, angry crowd. But his calm voice didn't quiet the voices of discontent. They were now convinced Cheap didn't care for them. Team Bulkley was only just able to keep them from storming the store tent and taking it all by force. If they gave out the liquor, chances were they'd get so drunk that they'd start fights that might end in murder and then famine. So, to pacify them a little, they agreed to up the rations to a pint of brandy per day. But at this rate, the liquor would barely last another 3 weeks. No one was leaving in 3 weeks. But as Cooper John Young pointed out, this concession silenced the stupid animals, though on reflection they must have realized that this indulgence might prove their misfortune. Bulkley, seeing the captain calm and possibly willing to listen to reason, said, "Sir, I think it my duty to inform you that I am not the person whom you imagine to be the principal in this affair." The captain answered, "How can I think otherwise?" Bulkley replied, "Sir, the paper I read to you was your lieutenant's plan. There sits the gentleman. Let him disown it if he can." The captain turned to the lieutenant and said, "Mr. Bulkley has honestly cleared himself." Well, that's what Bulkley said, he said. But the captain must have wondered, if this all had been the lieutenant's plan, why did the gunner and the carpenter so readily agree with it, knowing it was treason? Why didn't they oppose the plan? Most crewmen agreed. Bulkley and Cummins planned to go through the strait, and while their motives might have been pure, they were gearing up for an illegal act, mutiny. But the captain kept consulting them, confiding in them. Perhaps this was a case of keeping your friends close but your enemies closer, but it was more likely that the constant praises and reassurances of the gunner and the carpenter that they'd remain loyal to him had lulled the captain into a false sense of security, believing they'd never act against him. He certainly didn't think they would do anything stupid. Meanwhile, Bulkley gained the trust of the people because it was clear to all he was ready and willing to lay down his life for them. On August 29, 1741, 50 Indians arrived, men, women and children, with canoes laden with mussels. The castaways had never seen this group before, and they seemed quite different from the Coescar. For one, they had brought mussels not as a gift, but to trade. The following day, the natives launched their canoes and were not seen again. Now fights broke out over the stupidest things. And on September 1st, the captain's cook, William Moore, shot Carpenter Cummins in the thigh with several large pewter slugs. It was from a great distance, so the slugs didn't enter his skin, but since it was unclear if it was intentional or accidental, they disarmed Moore either way. On this day, several deserters showed up at base camp. They wanted to return to the fold, but Bulkley thought few people would welcome them back, so they left again. It became clear why they wanted to return the following day. Those at base camp heard that 3 of the deserters, their leader, the carpenter's mate John Mitchell, and seamen Joseph King and Owen Thompson, had gone to the Main in their homemade punt. They were never heard of again. The Wagerians' living was now very hard. Shellfish were hunted near extinction, and all they had to live on was seaweed, which came in all kinds of new shapes and sizes. Starvation was marching forth, and some were so famished that they considered the last extremity, eating the dead. Indeed, some began to butcher and eat their dead companions. Store tent robberies were now common, reducing the supplies ever more. On September 6, in the night, robbers stole brandy and flour from the store tent, causing a massive uproar at base camp. Were they sacrificing their lives only to sate the appetite of thieves? Everyone immediately eyed the Marines, and eager sailors searched their tents. They found 4 bottles of brandy and 4 small packs of flour hidden away. The Navy now saw the Marines as a gang of villains. Another round of meetings with the naval and marine officers. Another court-martial, but 5 of the accused Marines ran off to the deserters to avoid punishment. 4 more who stayed to be tried received the following sentence. On the first opportunity, they would be taken to the Main with Smith and Butler, where they had to fend for themselves along with the 3 deserters if they survived the crossing. The recovered provisions were returned to the store. Amid the famine, the master's mate John Jones and a posse came for Midshipman Byron's dog. They wanted to eat it to keep themselves from starving. Byron begged them to spare his beloved and faithful dog, but they didn't listen. They took him away by force and killed him. Byron joined these men at this so-called dog feast held in Jones's tent, where Lieutenant Baines, Gunner Bulkley, Carpenter Cummins, Midshipman Campbell, Cooper John Young, and Surgeon Vincent Oakley and the Lieutenants Robert Ewers and William Fielding of the Army also were. Since it was his dog being served, he felt he had at least as much right to a share as the rest. It was a very tasty meal, easily as good as English mutton. But as they said, hunger is a great sauce. The following day in the afternoon, William Harvey, quarter gunner, came to the hotel to deliver a paper signed by 7 people. They wanted to go with Team Bulkley through the strait on the Yawl. A day later, another name was added to the list. Peter Plastow, the captain's steward, who'd been fiercely loyal to Cheap up until then. But Bulkley told him he should ask the captain. After all, he wasn't in charge of the mission. The following day, September 10th, the captain sent for Lieutenant Baines, the master, the gunner, the carpenter and the boatswain and asked them if Plastow had mentioned anything to them about going off in the Yawl. They told him he had. The captain sent for Plastow and said, "Peter, I hear you're for going in the boat." He answered, "Yes, sir, I will take my chance for I want to get to England." The captain told him he was a villain and he should go, and said nothing more. Meanwhile, it was decided that all the boats should remain moored, because rumors increased that some intended to go north. The people became ever more restless. Hardly anyone did any work for a week, and everything had come to a grinding halt. There was no more command, order, or discipline. People were giving up. Of the 15 weeks they'd been stranded, they'd only had 10 fair days, making many a man weary of life. The weather had one benefit. The violent waves brought more and more stuff to the shore, so every now and then they got temporary relief from the hunger. On September 18th, the weather was a fine summer day, perfect to carry out the sentence for the 6 convicted Marines, including Smith and Butler. They were carried over to the mainland and left there to fend for themselves. The day after, with the improved weather, the barge made another trip to the wreck. The salvage team fished out 4 casks of beef and a cask of peas, which were immediately served. Each man ate 5 pieces of beef, but with their stomachs now filled, they didn't care for the peas. On September 23rd, some people showed up at the captain's place with a 2-gallon cask and wanted it filled with wine. The captain didn't want to, but since he figured if he refused they'd grab it by force, he ordered it filled anyway. These men brought it to the Longboat and drank it in her hold. That same day, they raised the forward mast on the Longboat, which was tricky because of the people in the hold being very drunk and petulant. Meanwhile, on September 8, 1741, Team Anson spotted sail on the horizon. They hoped this was one of their own, the Severn, the Pearl, or the Wager, but it veered off. A Spaniard, then. Did they see their tents ashore? It didn't matter. Off the Centurion went to capture her. But with so little wind, the ship disappeared in the dark. A few days later, another ship appeared. They chased her. It was a merchant vessel, the Nostra Senora del Monte Carmelo. They took everyone prisoner, seized the vessel and manned her. On board they found papers that explained why the trade embargo had been lifted. Admiral José Pizarro had warned the Viceroy of Peru that while he hadn't, some of the English ships might have rounded the Cape. The Spaniards sent out a fleet, but when they couldn't find any ships, they assumed all British hands had perished. The Brits were rejuvenated to hear this great news and they set sail for Valparaiso. Meanwhile, the trial caught the Aranthazu, which they renamed the Trial's Prize. Since the Trial herself was in a perpetual state of sinking, that vessel was scuttled, and the crew manned the Trial's Prize. Anson's new fleet was shaping up nicely. On September 24th, Gunner John Bulkley, Master's Mate John Jones, Midshipman John Byron, Purser Thomas Harvey, who is good at making drawings, and 10 others went in the barge for a week's cruise to map the coast to the south to see if it was safe for the longboat. The first harbor, a few leagues south of Wager Island, was a good one. They spent the night here and found a dog that they roasted to eat for supper and boiled for later. Very pleased with this meal, they slept well. On the 3rd day of the cruise, the explorers experienced bad weather and had to put into the first inlet they saw. It was a very fine bay again. They went ashore but found no food. Because of the rain, they pitched a tent in the woods. This tent wasn't large enough to fit all, so Midshipman Byron suggested that he and 4 others go to a skeleton of an old abandoned wigwam he had seen on a walk just after they landed. They covered it windward with seaweed and lit a fire. They tried to sleep through their hunger pangs. A little later, one of them woke up from a sound. With what little light the fire still cast, he made out the shape of a large snarling beast standing above him. He had the presence of mind to snatch a branch from the fire and thrust it in the animal's face, which then took off. After this, he woke everyone up to tell them about the harrowing encounter. The men now fell into an uneasy sleep. The following morning, the men were anxious to find out if the beast had also gone to the tent. Judging from the paw prints along the beach, they realized it had. Those in the tent had been visited by the same animal, but they too had driven it off with fire. Having seen that the coast was actually quite dangerous, they felt they had pushed the barge far enough in the violent seas and returned to Wager Island. On their return, they heard that 6 Indian canoes laden with men, women and children had arrived on Wager Island a week earlier. They brought clams strung on lines. The women dove for mussels and brought tons of them ashore, while the men caught several fish. Some people bought the Indians as dogs and killed them for a good meal. The following day, the natives had caught fish from a pond using their dogs, who dove and drove a good number of fish ashore, which the Indians then sold to the survivors. But after they left, the sailors tried to fish in the pond using a net and caught nothing. Members of the expedition, the lieutenant, the master, the gunner, the boatswain and the master's mate went to the captain to let him know what they found. So, south was doable, yes? Cheap asked them for a day or two to think about it. Team Bulkeley didn't realize it, but the captain was stalling for time. On October 5th, the Wagerians tipped the longboat over and caulked the starboard side with wax, tallow and soap they salvaged from the ship. The longboat was nearly finished, and everything was about to come to a head concerning in which direction the company would set sail, north or south. Meanwhile, the carpenter sent his bottle to the captain to be filled with wine, as he always did. It was sent back empty with the message that Cheap would give him nothing. Why? And why now? Well, when the carpenter heard someone say that the captain bribed people with liquor, he said he couldn't be bought. The captain thought Cummins had accused him of bribery, so he withheld the drink to show everyone he was bribing no one. Tensions were already at an all-time high and people were quick to irritate. This sudden change in the captain's behavior toward the carpenter was considered unjust and unreasonable. His case was falling apart faster than the Wager wreck. The carpenter now said he wouldn't finish the boat. So the captain sent for him and some officers and told him again that he would go anywhere they pleased. The following day, they got the longboat upright. The boat was finished and everything was now made ready for departure. The following morning, the lieutenant told Team Bulkeley that the captain was resolved to maintain his authority to the full extent and intended to govern as before according to the rules of the Navy and to stand or fall by them. Well, all hell broke loose. So he wanted to return to the old situation in which he didn't consult his officers, the old situation that caused him to wreck in the first place. Police! Who did he think he was? The situation was not the same as before. This situation was without precedent. Cheap needed an attitude adjustment if he wanted them to survive. The old rules no longer applied. Now they no longer recognized the authority of the captain on the island or on their journey home as being the same before they wrecked. If he were reasonable, they'd support his command with their lives, but some restrictions had to be put in place if they wanted to survive. He could have limited command, since he was too dangerous a person to be trusted with an absolute one. On October 8th, Gunner Bulkeley did a gunpowder inventory. One of the gunner's responsibilities on a ship is to keep the powder dry. He had 23 half barrels in store, but they could only carry 6 in the longboat. They should dunk the rest in the sea because these barrels were perfect for holding drinking water. But the carpenter and the gunner would no longer go near Captain Cheap, the two-timing bastard. So Bulkeley asked the lieutenant to tell the captain that he was gonna dunk the powder. The lieutenant also didn't want to go, fearing the captain would murder him. So Baines asked Master Clark to let the captain know they needed to start the powder. The master expected a very civil audience, thinking the others were just silly for being afraid to ask. Well, he returned in a foul mood, saying he wasn't gonna go near the captain again either. Cheap said that no one could do anything without his orders, and so no one could pour out a single grain of powder until he had to think about it. He'd let them know what he decided. That settled it. The captain had no intention of going with them, despite giving his word on his honor that he would. The master may have exaggerated a little bit, but the news of the captain's treason spread through base camp like a wildfire. Anyone who had an ounce of respect left for the captain lost it. But it didn't matter. Captain Pemberton jumped into action. That afternoon, he arrived on the beach and asked some of Team Bulkeley to assist him in arresting Captain Cheap for the death of Mr. Cousins, the midshipman. He insisted this wasn't out of spite or prejudice against the captain, but from a sense of duty. If he neglected his duty, he'd be called to account for it on his return to England. And all those who objected were considered accessories after the fact, and while they were at it, Marine Lieutenant Hamilton would also be confined. On October 9, 1741, a group of armed seamen entered Captain Cheap's tent and surprised the man, who was found asleep in his bed. They yanked him up, disarmed him, tied his hands behind his back, and then collected everything that belonged to him and prepared to take him outside. Cheap was completely outmanned and outgunned and offered no resistance. What would have been the point? He felt insulted and yelled, "What did they mean by such unparalleled insolence? And where were his officers?" The officers had been waiting outside, ready to step in if things got out of hand. When they heard him shout for them, the master, the carpenter, the gunner, and the boatswain rushed in. The captain said, "Gentlemen, do you know what you have done or are about? Are you aware of the consequences you must reap from so atrocious a villainy?" They answered, "Yes, sir. We have done nothing here that is not the effect of sober consideration. Nothing but what is our duty as subjects of Great Britain, that is to secure and carry you a prisoner to England, there to be tried for the murder of Mr. Cousins. And this we do at the insistence of Captain Pemberton, who required our assistance herein, and it is evidently our bounden duty." "What has Pemberton to do with me? Is he your commander, or am I not still so? Here are my instructions." He took them out of his pocket and handed them to the master. "Read them, and then judge if my conduct has in any wise contradicted them. What then can you mean by such a proceeding?" The men left him. Cheap then called his officers a second time and asked, "What is this for?" Well, Captain Pemberton required their help to take him prisoner for the death of Mr. Cousins. "But Pemberton had no power over him." "I would not think you would serve me so." "Sir, it is your own fault." He'd not cared about getting them to safety. He'd not cared about whether they would ever return to their home country. He'd not cared whether they had any provisions to sustain them during the voyage. He'd done the opposite and acted with carelessness and indifference. It was as if they had no commander. The captain turned to the seaman who had bound him and said, "Very well, gentlemen, you've caught me napping. None of you seem drunk. You are a group of brave fellows. My lads, I do not blame you, but it is the villainy of my officers, which they will answer for hereafter." They would be hanged for this mutiny. Boatswain King, still angry about being knocked down by the captain when they first got to the island, at last shouted, "Then it was your time, but now, goddamn you, it's mine." The captain only said, "You are a scoundrel for using a gentleman ill when he's a prisoner." Cheap turned to Bulkeley and said, "Gunner, where is my lieutenant? Did he not lead this charge?" Bulkeley told him no. He was there to see it executed. When Cheap called the lieutenant in, Baines merely stated he was assisting Pemberton. Once more the captain said, "Captain Pemberton has no jurisdiction over me, and you will answer for it hereafter. If I do not live to see England, I hope some of my friends will." This back and forth went on for nearly half an hour, but Team Bulkeley wouldn't budge. They'd done no crime. They'd not committed mutiny. They'd saved the people from a captain who seemed hell-bent on destroying them all. Cheap was taken to the purser's tent, but the captain requested to be allowed to stay in his own tent. Yeah, that wasn't gonna work. Hamilton's tent was right next to the purser's, and one sentinel could guard both. Cheap, half-dressed but wearing his hat, was led outside into the blistering cold. He tried to maintain some kind of dignity and told the gathered crowd, "Gentlemen, you must excuse my not pulling my hat off. My hands are confined." At last he declared that he never intended to go south. He had honor and would never turn his back on his enemy. "Furthermore, I do not want to go off in any of your craft, for I never designed to go for England, and would rather choose to be shot by you. There's not a single man on the beach dare engage me, but this is what I feared." He asked one favor of those who survived, to declare the truth without favor or prejudice. These were the words of a dying man, so they agreed. Midshipman Alexander Campbell, one of Cheap's early enforcers and friends, after being searched for weapons, was allowed to talk to the captain. He said that he'd always wanted to remain on the captain's side, but that he'd feared for his life if he spoke out against them. But if he remained on the island, he'd stay with him, an offer the captain gladly accepted. It was the Wagerians' new master's plan to leave only the yawl for those left behind, even though it was no longer seaworthy and not large enough to carry them anywhere. Campbell asked the men to leave the barge. He could, if he could convince 10 men to stay. He could only convince 3. The following day, the captain asked his lieutenant and the gunner to ask Captain Pemberton what he was planning to do with him. Baines bailed, and the gunner asked him instead. Pemberton gave him a short answer. "It is my design, sir, to carry him prisoner to England, as I am obliged." The captain was convinced he'd never live to see England and die instead by inches, that is to die a slow, painful death during the voyage. He still didn't understand why they wanted to go south so badly. North was 90 leagues away. It was where the prizes were. It was where the Commodore was. Bulkeley said north was also where a Spanish prison was. He'd rather be hanged in England than go north. And why had he broken his word? But the captain simply said sweetly, "Gentlemen, I wish you well and safe to England." The following morning, October 11th, the captain again sent for Gunner Bulkeley and dropped the sweet tone he had taken with him the previous day. He let it rip. The king, by whose commission he sailed, would make the mutineer pay for this. "I acknowledge you are a group of brave fellows and I have proper esteem of you as such, but you have transgressed all bounds of duty. Your courage has run up to frenzy. Everyone will die going south." He wouldn't leave the island unless by force, but he'd rather be shot dead on the spot. "I wish you all well at England, and if you ever reach it, as I pray God you may, I appeal to you to make a fair and candid representation of what has happened. That is, what I have done and how I've been used. In the meantime, I desire I may be suffered to remain here, and so I would have you tell the people." With a solemn face and a low parting bow, Bulkeley quickly charged out to tell the company. So he asked the Wagerians, should they bring the captain? He told the men they should give him what he wanted, because if they carried him home in chains, they'd be accused of false imprisonment, and Captain Pemberton may not have the power to excuse them. Some shouted, "For England! For England! Let him stay behind, alone, and be damned for wanting to carry us to a prison!" But they also agreed to leave him all the things he needed for his support, as much as they could spare. At this point, of the Wager's original 250 men and boys, only 91 were still alive, including the deserters. All passengers would be packed cheek by Yawl on the 3 boats. They had no prison on board, and the captain would leg it the first chance he got. And if he didn't, he might start whispering in others' ears to turn the men on their new masters. Besides, with him not going along, there'd be more room for provisions on board. Marine Lieutenant Hamilton and the surgeon Walter Elliot also decided to stay behind. Apparently, Midshipman Campbell still went with the crowd. The men booed the 2 men staying behind, but one man shouted, "Sink their bodies, my boys! If the silly sons of bitches will run to the devil, what's that to anyone?" And another answered, "Aye, by God, Jack, you are in the right." Fine, these men could stay, for all they cared. They were probably too scared to take the journey anyhow. Then they drew up an instrument of government, an official document outlining numerous misdemeanors of the abdicated commander and 4 articles of rules of conduct on the boats. It was signed by 48 men. The rules, in short, were: if anyone defrauded another concerning rations, they'd be left behind on the first opportunity. They had to stay together within musket shot. Those who didn't comply and ventured off on their own would be left behind. No one was to commit mutiny, fight with each other, or threaten the life of another. Those found guilty would be left behind. Found food would be shared equally in proportion, and if the captain came with them, the lieutenant couldn't release him. On Monday, October 12th, the Longboat was launched with all the boat launching ceremonies. She was christened the Speedwell, which God preserved to deliver them. As you may recall, the Speedwell was the name of the boat that the castaway British buccaneer George Shelvocke and his men had built from the timber of their sunken ship, also called the Speedwell, with which they returned to England. Time to load the vessel. Gunner Bulkeley ordered the men to fill the empty gunpowder barrels with rainwater for drinking, and to cut up and dress the few remaining portions of meat. Then he had their meager supplies, including some bags of flour stored on the boats, and handed the captain, the surgeon, and Mr. Hamilton their share of the supplies. Meanwhile, the men took the cloth that had been salvaged to make new trousers and coats. The following day, Master's mate John Snow went to the deserters to ask if they wanted to join Team Bulkeley or Team Cheap. If they went with Bulkeley, all would be forgiven for what they did in the weeks past. If they wanted to remain, they would leave them a proportionate share of everything they had. After some deliberation and consulting among themselves, they decided on the latter. They were comfortable enough for now. They gave the captain the share of provision for the deserters and various necessities, among them ammo, Hamilton and Cheap's pistols, a compass, other navigational tools, and a Bible. Then they prepared to set sail. Bulkeley went to bid the captain adieu, who again asked that on his return to England he would impartially relate all proceedings. Bulkeley remarked, "He spoke to me in the most tender and affectionate manner, and as a token of his friendship and regard for me, desired me to accept a suit of his best wearing apparel. At parting he gave me his hand with a great deal of cheerfulness, wishing me well and safe to England." Cooper Young said, Bulkeley returned seemingly much affected with the tender reception he had found and the melting farewell at parting. At 11 a.m., 81 souls embarked, 59 on board the Speedwell, 12 on the cutter, and 10 on the barge. But Captain Pemberton and his marines stood on the beach, determined to take Captain Cheap on board. After Bulkeley talked them out of it, "Leave the man be," they too boarded the vessel. At noon they weighed anchor and got under sail. Captain Cheap, Surgeon Elliot, and Lieutenant Hamilton stood on the shore, watching the dapper little fleet of mutineers sail off. Bulkeley said that they gave them 3 cheers, and that Team Cheap returned them. This sounded all very amicable, and a tad unbelievable. Cooper Young certainly thought this didn't sound like the captain at all, as they were quite unsuitable with the gallant spirit of that haughty officer, whose genius and disposition were formed to command, but never could descend to cringe or charm. To hear Bulkeley's moving account, you'd have thought he was painting the last separation of David and Jonathan. This is what Cheap had to say. Keep in mind that from here on out the dates between the groups diverge. They sailed on the 14th of October 1741, saying when they went off with the utmost insolence and inhumanity, that I might take my leave of Englishmen, for I never would see any more of them than what they left with me, who were only Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Elliot my surgeon, who refused to go on board except they submitted themselves to my command, and 7 more that were upon an island about 5 or 6 miles distant from us. They likewise left a very small quantity of extraordinarily bad flour and a few pieces of salt meat. Their design, as well as I could be informed, was to sail through the Straits of Magellan for the coast of Brazil. What adventures awaited them all you'll hear in the next episode. Perish or pull. Until then.